is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We have a lot to discuss with you today. We have Tropical Storm Dexter to talk about, as well as two other areas of interest that pose a potential threat to the east coast of the United States. One in the short term, one in the long run. The one in the long run we'll pay attention to. And then we have another potential area of interest in the Caribbean that has really seen the ensembles and even some of the operational models in the last 48 hours really flare up for that probability over there. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive into all of it right now. All right, so this is what we have from the National Hurricane Center for you guys. We have Tropical Storm Dexter. We're going to go over this briefly, and then we're going to be talking more in depth with the two other areas of interest as well. So we're going to be going ahead and talking about Dexter first, and then we'll get to those areas, because what we have going on with Dexter, it's weakening. Its maximum sustained winds are at 40 miles per hour. It's moving northeast at 12 miles per hour, and its minimum central pressure has risen to 1,005 millibars, up from 1,002 at this current point in time. Tropical storm force winds extend outward 115 miles from the center, so we're going to want to watch that. If you are watching this and are concerned about shipping and all of that stuff, you're going to want to still watch this as this transitions into an extratropical cyclone. But at this current point in time, there's not really too much to talk about. We'll talk about the discussion briefly, and then we'll get on with the main meat of the video. Overall, little change was made to either the track or intensity forecast for this package. There is some model spread with the forward speed of Dexter, with the GFS remaining the outlier on the slower side and the European faster. However, run-to-run continuity on the models has been low with the details, and the previous forecast will remains within this spread. Expect that we will continue to see run-to-run variability, and thus there will be no strong evidence that a change of track forecast will be needed at this time. The new forecasts is similar to the previous one, given a little bit weight to the slower GFS. Here's the main stuff that we have for you right here. It's expected to become an extratropical cyclone in the next next 48 hours or so. And then after that, it's going to be 50 miles per hour. They're forecasting this to strengthen a little bit as it becomes extratropical. But at this current point, we'll have to see what happens with that moving forward. And we'll keep a very close eye on that as well. But we'll not keep as close of an eye on that as we will with these other areas of interest right here, because these are the big kahunas that we're talking about right here, and we're going to go ahead and start with the one that's more the short-term threat to land, which is this area of interest closest to the Carolinas and Florida, and then we'll talk about the MDR area of interest in a second. A weak surface trough located several hundred miles off the coast of the southeastern United States is producing scattered showers and thunderstorms this afternoon. An area of low pressure is expected to develop from this system in the next day or so, where environmental conditions appear generally favorable for additional development. A tropical depression could form by the latter portion of this week or weekend as the low starts to slowly move westward, but turns more to the north by this weekend. 10% chance of formation in the next 48 hours, 40% in the next 7 days. So we're going to want to watch that very closely. The reason we're going to want to watch this closely is because this poses a pretty decent threat to land. We've been seeing the ensembles really explode with this over the last 24 hours, and we're going to want to keep an eye on it in case we have another sleeper situation like we did with Tropical Storm Chantal, where it kind of organized and developed, grew to a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm, and then ended up making landfall in South Carolina as that intensity. So we're going to want to watch that as well. But the big thing that we're watching now is the main development region, AOI, because in the long run, and we'll show you some forecasts, we'll show you some models talking about that. In the long run, what we're potentially seeing is a pretty decent area, a pretty decent threat to a lot of areas, potentially in the Bahamas, potentially in Florida, potentially in the Carolinas, because what we're seeing from there is a pretty interesting weather pattern that we'll discuss with you in a few minutes. But right now, we're going to go ahead and go over the discussion, and then we'll get into the main meat. A tropical wave over the far eastern tropical Atlantic is currently producing disorganized showers and thunderstorms. environmental conditions are forecast to be conducive for gradual development over the next few days, and a tropical depression could form by late this week or over the weekend as the system moves generally west-northwestward across the central tropical or subtropical Atlantic. Formation chance in the next 48 hours is at 0%. Formation chance in the next 7 days is at 50%. So ultimately no change with this right now, but I am saying that this is going to be more of a long-term threat, and I've been talking to my tropical team about it at Storms United pretty much ad nauseum about this, and what we're thinking is this system's actually going to most likely wait until it gets out of the main development region and then start to organize and develop. Most likely it would do it in the Atlantic Basin, closer towards the Lesser Antilles, if you're thinking about it further to the west at this current point, and then we'll have to see what happens from there. But I've been seeing quite a few runs and quite a few models and quite a few conditions that do have me somewhat alarmed. Now, granted, by the time it does pose a threat to land, it's still very far out, and there's still a lot of uncertainty regards to that. But I do want to keep an eye on it because the trends have continued to push it further and further and further to the west, and we're going to want to pay attention to that, especially as we're seeing some pretty concerning ridging that's going to start moving and developing in parts of the United States that could yank it further to the west and closer towards land. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get into some conditions, and then we'll get into the models and talk more about that. All right, we're going to start with our water temperatures. Yes, we are using tropical tidbits, ladies and gentlemen, because we don't really have any updated information from the other stuff that we have, so we'll use tropical tidbits for this. So here's your sea surface temperatures, folks, and they are very piping hot. This is just the western Atlantic right here, but given the fact that these areas of interest may not develop, especially the MDR one may not develop until we get towards the western part of the Atlantic, I think it's more important to hone in and look at these and kind of take a look at these in a vacuum. So looking at this, starting with the short-term threat off the Carolina coast over here, man, you are looking at 29 to 30 degrees Celsius already. That is pretty interesting, to say the very least. So you're going to want to watch and see how that pans out, because these are very piping hot water temperatures. In fact, we've been seeing a lot of kind of records being broken on the East Coast with sea surface temperatures along beaches and all of that stuff. I know in Chesapeake Bay we reached about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. 86 degrees Celsius is not 86 degrees Celsius. 30 degrees Celsius is 86 degrees Fahrenheit. If 86 degrees Celsius of water happened, that would be a massive problem. So I do apologize for saying that. But ultimately, what I'm looking at with this is, man, this makes me kind of concerned for tropical development, and this is part of the reason I've been talking to my tropical team about this. In fact, they have been looking at this, and they're going, if anything goes into the southwestern Atlantic, it will take off. And we'll show you another reason as to why in a second, but if you're taking a look at this MDR setup and you're looking at it going into the Atlantic Basin, 28, 29, 30 degrees Celsius in a lot of these areas right here, and that is something you're going to want to pay attention to right there. Already you're looking at 29 degrees Celsius pretty much from close to 40 degrees north all the way down to the Caribbean. That is very concerning, and that is very alarming, to say at the very least. So you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. We'll keep you updated on that. But then the Gulf waters as well, you're looking at up to 31, 32 degrees Celsius. That's close to 90 degrees Fahrenheit in those areas right there. And that is also pretty worrisome for me as well. And especially if we do have another system coming after that, potentially heading into the Caribbean, that is going to be even more concerning with that. So we're going to want to pay attention to all of this moving forward. But also we need to watch the ocean heat content, because this is the big reason why I'm so concerned about this. Look at the amount of OHC we have here. So even for your short-term system, you're going to be tapping into at least 75 OHC. That is conducive for rapid strengthening alone. Now, granted, it depends on the storm's organization and the structure and all of that stuff and the consolidation, but the fact that you're seeing these kinds of water temperatures is pretty disturbing to me. not just that, but the OHC, especially that far to the north, is pretty disturbing. To say that, especially in parts of the southwestern Atlantic where both of these AOIs are potentially going, you're going to want to pay attention to that. And then the Caribbean, looking at that as well. Look at this. 175 plus OHC is starting to pop up all over the place in the northwestern Caribbean. That is your big kahuna in terms of tropical development and rapid intensification. Not saying that rapid intensification can't happen anywhere else, but that's the most likely area that's going to happen. And you absolutely do not want to see that going forward. But then you're looking at the loop current, 150 plus OHC. The Western Gulf has surged in OHC as well. And ultimately, what you have going on across much of the Atlantic is pretty much a water temperature and OHC area primed for development. And that is something you're going to want to watch over the next week or so as these systems organize, develop, and strengthen, and do all of that stuff right there. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about wind shear very quickly. And starting with the wind shear, this is another area we need to watch very, very closely. Let's go ahead and go out to about 48 hours out at this current point. This is 48 hours out. Look at this. A lot of the wind shear across much of the tropics is collapsing. That is a huge problem. And this continues across much of the time. You're looking at 72 hours now. The Caribbean is now pretty much shear-free. Much of the MDR is shear-free. You still have a little bit of shear in the Atlantic Basin, but that's going to move out of the area. And then the Gulf is mostly shear-free. Those are areas you're going to want to pay attention to. And especially in the next 7 days or so, you're going to want to see how this will evolve in the southwestern Atlantic. The shear just continues to be weak over here. There's no strong shear that enters this region for quite some time, and you're going to want to pay attention to that moving forward. And even in the Caribbean, you're watching this shear over here. There's not very strong wind shear with this either. And another thing you're going to want to pay attention to, and we'll get to it more in a second, is the high pressure over here with the ridge. And ultimately, your wind shear patterns across much of the Atlantic remain pretty weak and remain pretty open for business. Moving over to the moisture component, just to show you that, here's what we got. Yes, there is some dry air currently moving into parts of the MDR and the Caribbean, but look at this. You're seeing a pretty big moisture surge and a huge moisture infusion across much of the region right here, across much of the Atlantic. Moving forward. Now, granted, the European does kind of have this, at least at 0Z, have the system moving out to sea, but I've looked at other runs and I've looked at other conditions as well, and have kind of indicated to me that this is potentially going to be heading towards the west more so than out to sea, and I'll talk about those in a second. But by and large, what you have right here is you have some dry air, don't get me wrong, but you also can mix that out pretty easily if a tropical wave and a tropical cyclone moves through that region. So you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. But now we can go ahead and move on to this right here, because this is what I want to really talk about. These are the high pressure systems right here. These are your steering currents. What exactly is that going to do? And for this, I'm going to use the GFS, not just because I prefer any bias or anything like that, but because I feel like the GFS highlights this a bit better at this current point in time, and it's more consistent with what the models are showing, so we'll go ahead and use it for the sake of this exercise. So looking at this, what you have is you have your ridge over Quebec and Canada right here. That's kind of remains there for some time. You do have a couple of troughs and a couple of low pressure systems move through, but as the tropical cyclone starts to move through, you have another high pressure system starting to develop. You have your Bermuda High and a high pressure system off the Appalachians right there that kind of stays over there and kind of hugs. And then you have the rebuilding of your ridge over here in Canada that allows for the system to drive further to the west. So what does this mean exactly? Well, this means basically two things that I'm pointing out. The first thing I'm pointing out is, as long as the system remains pretty weak and doesn't develop right away, which honestly I don't think it will at this current point, in my opinion, the AOI area is not going to develop until it gets past the main development region and goes into the Atlantic Basin. But by that point, it's going to get caught into that ridge over in Canada, and you're going to want to pay attention to that as well, because primarily what you have with a ridge setup like that is what that does is it drives tropical waves and tropical cyclones further to the west. And typically if you have a weak system and you have just an open wave, they're going to move further to the west instead of going and getting yanked out to sea like you would see with stronger systems. So that's what you're dealing with right here. And at this current point, let's go ahead and do some geography with this. Where this wave currently is, it's in an area of about, I would say, about 30 degrees west. I think NHC marks this at 30 degrees west, actually, right over here. And it's as long as it keeps moving further to the west or west-northwest, if it stays on its current course and moves past this line right here, which is 60 degrees to the west, it's going to keep going. And if we see development maybe happening earlier and start to see some strengthening happening earlier, there would be less of a possibility of this heading towards land. But given the ridge pattern and given the environment that we have at this current point in time, which will only get more and more favorable the further west it goes, in my opinion, as well as the opinion of many in our tropical team at Storms United, at this current point, it's likely not going to develop until it moves past that 60-degree west longitude. So that's another area that you're going to want to pay attention to as well. We're just thinking long-term right here, pay attention right there. But ultimately, that's kind of your situation that you have right here. And the models still are a bit uncertain as to what's going to happen. Some have it going out to sea. Some have it heading further to the west. We'll go ahead and show you that, and I'll give you my opinion at the end of the video. So starting with the GFS right here, you have the system organizing and developing at a relatively slow pace until it gets past that 60-degree west threshold, and then it starts to intensify at a pretty decent rate, and then kind of as it approaches the Bahamas at the 12Z, it kind of intensifies into a hurricane right there as it approaches Florida and the southeastern United States, so you're going to want to pay attention to that. Because one thing I will tell you right here is we're going to have better conditions. You're going to have better moisture. You're going to have better shear, plenty of warm water in the southwestern Atlantic. And Alex Baller actually made this quote pretty discreetly. And what he told us was, if this system survives and enters the southwestern Atlantic, it will explode. Those are his words, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm not trying to take anything out of context or anything like that. I also want to make it clear that this is a very long-term threat, and this is a pretty big if that's going to be happening. But ultimately, you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. And I do think given the ridging pattern is remaining consistent and kind of having it build up as the system moves further to the west, I think that's going to mainly be the main thing that we're going to want to pay attention to. And we'll keep you updated here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. One last thing I do want to briefly talk about is the potential area of interest in that I have in my tagged in the Caribbean, and I'll go ahead and show you why. I will say I will say that from what I've seen from the early returns of the 12Z from the European, at least from what my tropical team has been showing me, there has been a drop-off of tropical development in this region. But looking at 12Z from yesterday and looking at the 0Z run, this is 10 days out, you already had a pretty big consistent signal heading into the Caribbean from another tropical wave that'll be coming off the coast of Africa in a couple of days. Developing in the MDR and then moving through this region right here into the Caribbean, which will, as we already highlight, there will be very good conditions in that region. And then as we get to the 0Z, those really started to skyrocket right here. But I will say from the 12Z returns I've seen so far, it does look like it's going to drop off a bit. We'll keep you updated on all of these threats right here, and we'll continue to keep you updated here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. We're going to be live streaming tonight starting at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, talking about all of these threats and how they're going to pan out potentially for those of you tuning in on the East Coast and in the Caribbean. So stay tuned for that. But with that being said, we're closing the video out right here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. If you want to help out, hang out, or ask us some questions, be sure to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe. Whoa. The latest outlook from the CPC just dropped. they're now highlighting a greater than 40% probability over parts of the MDR for week 2. And then for week 3, a larger, greater than 20% probability in the similar region. This is consistent with the signals we are seeing right here. We are definitely covering this tonight.